Hello, and thank you for joining us from across the globe for today's conversation. How should online speech be governed? I'm Stephen Salyer, president of Salzburg Global Seminar, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's program. This conversation is the seventh installment in Salzburg Global's Designs on the Future initiative, highlighting bold and sometimes controversial visions for a more just and sustainable future. Salzburg Global Seminar was founded in 1947 by Austrian and American students at Harvard University who asked how Europe could avoid a third world war in the 20th century. Since then, we have brought together nearly 40,000 current and rising leaders, legal thinkers, political activists, technological and cultural innovators, crossing sectors, geographies, generations, and political divides in search of solutions to transnational problems. The role that media play in shaping our perception of events has been a cross-cutting theme for most of our 74 years. As a very young man before the invention of the internet and social media, I attended a Salzburg seminar on the social impact of mass communications. Of course, in those days, we were talking about a proliferation of magazines and newspapers, and broadcast radio and television channels, etc. But many of the questions we discussed about bias, truth, access, control, still resonate today very strongly. In 2007, Salzburg Global launched the Academy on Media and Global Change, with leading universities on 5 continents, examining comparatively how the internet was changing and is changing news, entertainment, education, commerce, political expression, and participation. The rise of social networks has changed the way we think about community and challenges how we think about familiar phrases like the marketplace of ideas. The degree to which a few platforms now dominate online speech also serves up major issues for who shall be heard and how much speech we get and which speakers may be limited. In 2018, Facebook announced the creation of the Facebook Oversight Board to adjudicate content flagged as violating policies set by the company and appeals by Facebook users to remove or restore content on the platform. Composed of 20 global leaders, legal professionals, journalists, former politicians, and human rights activists, the court represents a new approach to internet regulation. Is it effective? Is it enough? Are users prepared to accept and abide by its judgments? Is Facebook itself? What are its guiding stars? Legal, ethical, practical? Will other companies and platforms take inspiration or lessons from its work? Today, we will explore the Oversight Board's independence, influence, operating methods, and limitations with 2 of the board's trustees, Paul Haga and Cristina Arriaga. Cristina has worked on the defense of rights of expression in the US and internationally for over 30 years, serving as a member of the US delegation to the UN Human Rights Commission, the US Civil Rights Commission, and the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. Arriaga is a recipient of the Museum's Free Expression Award as well. Paul Haga is the inaugural chair of the Oversight Board Trust. From 2017 to 2020, he was the board chair of NPR, National Public Radio, in the United States. He retired in 2012 as chair of the board of Capital Research and Management Company. Paul also served 2 terms on Salzburg Global Seminars board of directors. So welcome, Christina and Paul. It's great to have you here with us on this Minds on the Future conversation. And I want to start by, sort of opening to the two of you to maybe share just briefly kind of what got you involved in this, how you got interested, and anything else you'd like to sort of open us with today. Paul, I think you were going to lead, or is that, or Christina?
Christina's going to lead by asking me a question.
Okay, over to you, Christina.
Paul, you have had this enormously successful career in a regulated market. What compelled you to say yes to this extraordinary challenge of regulating Facebook?
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks, Stephen and Louise, for asking us to do this. It's a great honor for me to be back at Salzburg, and we've been coming to Salzburg. Heather and I, Heather was former board chair, my wife, and we've been coming back to Salzburg for years and years and participating in a lot of programs. And I'm delighted to be able to participate in this one and welcome all my colleagues. And those of you who have not yet been to Salzburg, please do come at some point in addition to all your Cutler and other participations. Briefly, I spent my career in and around mutual funds. I after law school and business school, I got a job at the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, regulating mutual funds. Then I was in private practice representing them. And then I spent the largest part of my career in a mutual fund organization, Capital Research. And what I found, even while I was on the private side, I stayed very involved in self-regulation and the mutual fund industry through what's now called FINRA, formerly NASD, and through its trade association, the Investment Company Institute, had a very effective, very participatory self-regulation. And I got to see the benefits of self-regulation. Basically, I won't go into all the details, but a self-regulator can A, have access to a lot more internal knowledge, and B, an understanding in the industry, and B, do a lot of things that an external regulator can't. And so I became a great believer in self-regulation. And when they called me up and said, did I want to think about doing this? I wasn't a participant in Facebook or any other social media for that matter. I just didn't do it. And so of course, right before I signed on, I joined, but and now use it to wish happy birthday to people, and not for anything else. But I truly believe, and by the way, every experience I've had has made me believe that self-regulation is something that can really work here. But Christina, you asked me the question, what about you? Why are you doing this?
Well, I'm sure you hear my accent. I'm Cuban American. My parents fled Fidel Castro's Cuba. Actually, my mother is German. She had fled Germany after World War II, had gone to Cuba. And when Fidel Castro took over in 1959, my father told my mother, this will blow over in 2 months. And my mother said, been there, done that. I'm leaving soon. But in the process, they saw a lot of their friends getting arrested for having private conversations in their homes and go to prison. And when we first went into exile, we lived in Puerto Rico, and I remember we didn't have air conditioning, scorchingly hot in the Caribbean. My father would close all the windows before we had any conversation that might be seen controversial. And once my parents understood that their freedom of expression was protected, they told us, me and my 2 siblings, that to allow anyone to silence us in any way was a betrayal of the people that have made so many sacrifices before us to ensure that we had freedom of expression. So to me, the social media platforms have been a game changer in allowing individuals in countries like Cuba to be able to express themselves. Just last November, a Black artist, a rapper, who had a very little audience, streamed his arrest in Facebook by government thugs. They were arresting him because he was rapping against the government. And that caused demonstrations around Cuba, and that has not happened in 50 some odd years. So first, the idea that social media platforms could continue to be a game changer for the human rights community. Second, I was very intrigued with the idea that the oversight board could be a catalyst to create a new culture of freedom of expression worldwide. We all know that laws don't necessarily change human behavior, that it's culture that can change laws. Let me give you an example. The constitutions of North Korea and Russia and Cuba, they all protect freedom of expression, but in reality, that's not happening. When you create a strong and robust culture of freedom of expression, then you have the ability to create laws that support those cultures. And the idea that 2.9 billion users could experience that freedom of expression, I thought could be a great strategic advantage to also creating laws and creating cultures in places where freedom of expression is not necessarily guaranteed. It's been an amazing opportunity to work with groups of experts who have interdisciplinary abilities as well and context. That's one of the genius of the Salzburg project, and that is that you can have people from different disciplines looking at the same issue from different angles and then project into the future what they could do. So those were three of the reasons. And of course, how can you resist Paul asking you to serve on a board? So that was a great part of it.
Great. Well, Stephen, let take us back to maybe the beginning and just give level set with a description of the organization that Christine and I are part of. This all started a little over a year ago, and it was really started by Mark Zuckerberg. He had the idea, and the idea was pretty straightforward. It was, they were getting a lot of criticisms that really important decisions relating to free speech, but also to protection of listeners from certain speech were being made by, a guy who started a online, social media platform in his dorm room, and it suddenly grows to several billion users. And that the person who really should be making these kinds of decisions, that person and his colleagues. And I think he really believes that. Christine and I met him a number of times, and I think he really believes that. And people attribute other motives to him, avoiding regulation by governments or UNs or people like that. And those may be there, but I think he really did believe that. The way they've set it up, we kind of have three sort of descriptions of what we are. One is the one Stephen referred to, the Facebook's Supreme Court. The other is the one that I kind of came with, which is a self-regulatory organization. And then others consider us like a human rights tribunal that's often set up by two parties to a treaty, either following a war of some kind or some dispute, but it's set up and given the authority it has. There are elements of each, but we are singular, and so any efforts to sort of push us into exactly fitting one of those can be counterproductive, and so we use those terms, but we resist overusing them. But anyway, essentially what happened was they set up a trust. The trust was given $130 million to begin with, and the trust is funded by Facebook, but they can't get the money back no matter what. The trust has trustees, Christina and I and 5 others, and we manage the entity. We have about 65 employees called the Oversight Board Administration. They do all the research, they do the draft the opinions, they circulate the opinions among the board members. And then the decision-making bodies, Christina and I are not we are responsible for the care and feeding of, for the hiring and replacement of the board members, but there are 20 board members now from around the world, initially selected by Facebook, but in the future will be selected by us as trustees as they're replaced or term out. And they are, I hope people have seen lists of them. There's a bunch of lawyers, there's justices of Supreme Courts, there's human rights advocates, there are many professors, there are lawyers, law professors, and really a highly respected global group. They sit in groups of 5 to hear cases. One of the rules is usually that not usually, one of the rules is that one of the members will be from the region where the case arose, to bring some local cultural understanding to it. The other 4 are randomly selected, and they look at all the materials that are submitted, look at the arguments, look at what the public submits, and we commend you to everybody on this call to please, if you're interested in the case we have, please submit go up on our website and submit a comment. And then they produce an opinion, and then a majority of the remainder of the board has to sign on. So 11 out of 20, but not everybody has to sign on to the opinion. You will see and reflected in our opinions, the board's opinions, oftentimes there will be reference to a minority view about it that they want to share, but clearly weren't part of the case.
Oh, that's great. That helps clarify, I think, a number of questions of relationships that people, I think, have been confused about, in which, the press discussion doesn't always illuminate. I'm wondering, as we all know, Facebook is a vast operation, as you said, billions of participants and many complaints. And they go across the whole spectrum of issues, political and otherwise. How were determinations made about which cases to accept out of all of those complaints or pressures that I'm sure must come to bear? What are the criteria that are used to make those selections?
Go ahead, Christina.
You are right that Facebook is a massive enterprise. As was said earlier, it's 2.9 billion users. It's the largest country in the world. It doesn't have borders. It's not regulated by any government. And if I could just take a quick step back, as Paul mentioned, the regulation schemes are limited. So Facebook agreed with the several governments that it should be regulated, but no government could step forward and regulate such a massive enterprise. And the United Nations human rights legal system is also not equipped to handle something like this. That's why they set up this self-regulatory entity. This entity is just a year old. It's an iterative process, meaning that it's still trying to figure out how to walk, how to operate, how to move. The board members have received, since the portals for the Oversight Board opened, over 400,000 appeals. In addition to Mark Zuckerberg Facebook asking the Oversight Board what it should decide regarding President Trump, whether President Trump should be banned indefinitely. So the criteria that is generally used to select the cases has to do with the ability for that particular case to illustrate an issue that Facebook is handling or wrestling with, in order to create consistency, clarity, and transparency in the way that Facebook makes determinations, so that any user, if they're sent to Facebook jail, or understands why they were sent to Facebook jail and what to do about it. And if you read the Trump decision, the headline is precisely that the Oversight Board is telling Facebook you have community standards. Those standards have to be very clear to all the users, and you yourself have to have a way to follow your own rules and your own standards with great clarity. So this, and again, it's a process that's still taking shape, and it's a process where all of us are very much watching what experts around the world are saying about how it will work.
Yeah.
Thank
Let me
you
do
for tackling that Trump question. Paul, I'm going to keep us moving forward here if I can for a minute. It sounds a little bit like, as you describe which cases you take, where they're looking for cases that can illustrate sort of classes of, of issues that may be thought about for the future or taken up in the future. It's not exactly the same thing as legal precedent in formal judiciary proceedings, but to what extent is it a kind of quasi precedent setting process? I mean, to what extent does the board see itself as providing advice that will guide future decision making rather than having to take up individually all of these issues one by one?
Well, these cases come out of something Facebook did. And the way Facebook takes down or leaves up is they have algorithms that identify things. And then they have 35,000 people, some are contractors, some employees, who sit there around the world, and they get either something the algorithm kicked out for a takedown, or something that another user complained about. That's their two sources of things, and then they'll look at them, and they'll look at them against the Facebook community standards. And I think we've talked a little bit about them. I think most people know, can't incite violence or support those who do. There's a child exploitation, harassment, bullying, hate speech, can't encourage suicide, can't invade privacy, must post under your real name, etc. And then there's certain categories people always ask about, and I'm going off on a tangent a little bit here, but I'll come back. People always ask about, what are you doing about misinformation? Misinformation is hard. There's no algorithm that can search for truth perfectly. But there are certain areas where the algorithms do kick out information, and we do remove false information. And there's three of them we worked on. One is COVID, one is Holocaust denial, and the other is the US election, where we actually have algorithms that will kick out any piece that seeks to contain those. In fact, we've removed, since the COVID crisis started, we've removed 18 million, Facebook has removed 18 million pieces that were said, that were alleged to be false information about COVID. But anyway, what the algorithms kick things out that seem to violate the community standards. They go to the 35,000 reviewers. The 35,000 reviewers can leave them off or keep them up. And then, as Christina mentioned, you can appeal, and we've gotten 400,000 appeals. What and this is back to your more specifically to your question about precedent. The board selects cases not just because they want to get them right, the leave up or the take down decision, but because they can have an impact on the community standards. And it's the community standards Facebook has, which are on the website, everybody can read them, and I just recited some of them, that determine what gets automatically kicked out or elevated to one of the 35,000 to look at and consider. And if you look back at all our opinions, all the opinions are yes, leave it down, no, put it back up from the board. But they always add something else about how Facebook should refine its community standards or its processes so that the whole system will be fairer, more accurate, more complete. So that's why they're picking them, not just because the algorithms got it wrong or the 35,000 got it wrong. It's because there's something to be said that can improve things about the community standards.
Given the range of communities that Facebook operates across in every sense of how one might define community, how do you get at the essence of what is a community standard? And it does, I think, also relate to the point I believe Christina made earlier about all the different legal jurisdictions and political jurisdictions across which Facebook operate, with different views of national law on issues like privacy or acceptable standards of expression. How does the court actually create cross-national advice that takes those variations into account without being completely stymied by them?
You want to start, Christina, and then I'll add a.
Sure. So I'd like to say that even though the oversight board often functions like a court, looks like a court, and has a lot of lawyers, it's actually not a court. It's an institution that's looking at how to preserve in balance freedom of expression in balance with other human rights. So your question is right. What is the normative framework that is used when looking at an individual issue, when looking at a particular case? And that framework is the framework of precisely Facebook community standards. Now, if we take 3 steps back, we know that corporations can function according to their own values. So for instance, when the apartheid South Africa was being embargoed, corporations and companies all over the world refused to set up a commercial relationship with a government that they considered to be indecent and immoral and racist and all the things that we know. Well, the company, Facebook, drafted a set of community standards that fit its own values. And essentially those values are the preservation of freedom of expression in balance with other harms that could come, like Paul just said, protecting children, making sure that suicide is not being promoted as an option, misinformation, etc. So when the board members are looking at the community standards, they're also balancing those community standards with international principles of freedom of expression, as articulated in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the following instruments. And that is part of its value because it's creating new ways to dialogue about social media platforms that no other social media platform has ever done before. Facebook is the only platform that has created an independent entity to work through these issues. And that entity invites intellectuals and invites commentary from the public. The Trump decision received over 9,000 comments, and each one of those comments were read by the staff and summarized for the board members. So the idea of having this conversation, this dialogue with people from all over the world about all these issues is one that is shaping the formation of the values of the Oversight Board.
I'll jump in here. You asked a general question and Christina answered it very well with the general thing. I just want to add an anecdote that will back it up, or maybe clarify it. Many local governments have laws that say you can't criticize the government. We don't have an algorithm, Facebook doesn't have an algorithm that picks up criticism of local governments. So the way that issue gets to the Facebook or the reviewers is only because Facebook's not picking it up. It only comes from the government or another user complaining and saying, this is critical, please take this down. And there's a practice there where there are local people among the 35,000 who then have a discussion with the government and uniformly argue that it should not be taken down simply because it has criticism of the government. We then they if they oftentimes we are told they've been able to get the government to agree that, oh, okay, you can leave it up. If they can't get them to agree, unfortunately, we would have to take it down because many of these are criminal laws, and we have people located, employees and consultants located in those countries. And so we would then reluctantly take it down, but not without a fight, and we would never take something down proactively that violated a local law prohibiting criticism of the government.
Well, thank you both. That's very illuminating. We're going to turn just in a moment to questions from the audience, and I know I can tell from some of the chat that there are a lot of people waiting to get into the conversation, so I don't want to delay that very long. But I just would, you touched on one way in which Facebook, and as an extension of this work, is trying to interact with standard setting and with the work of governments in regulating speech, even though it is a private entity. And of course, we're all familiar with friend of court briefs that people file in judicial settings, and often, or dissenting opinions that often include the basis of future decisions that don't happen for years until they're considered. Are there other ways in which, say, Facebook is now, or the oversight board and court anticipate putting forward positions that you believe might be influential in the way people think about standards surrounding areas like speech or punishment of criticism of governments? Or is this all to remain very much an inside, off the record process?
Paul, you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, I'll start. We are a bulletin board, not a publisher. Facebook is a bulletin board, not a publisher. So we start with that. But Facebook has, and it does publish many opinions about many that are its own, often in the words of Mark Zuckerberg, about the importance of free speech, but also about the importance of civility and decency and other standards. So it is out there, but it's sort of within the context of Facebook very much wanting to remain and be mostly a place where other people's views are posted and commented upon and circulated and stimulate other conversation rather than itself becoming an editorial device. Christina?
It's independent, if I understand it, from Facebook management. So it does give it a way both to get external advice on some of these difficult questions, but potentially could have a voice of its own. And I guess I'm asking, to what extent do individual members of the Facebook board see the possibility of expressing viewpoints, and to what extent are some of the very extensive, well-researched opinions that are being developed something that you feel can and should be circulated more widely to public bodies as well as private individuals?
All of the oversight board decisions are public, and the board members remain anonymous for security and safety factors. However, the process of thinking and about the issues that they're encountering, as well as the rationale, is beautifully articulated in each one of the decisions. Eventually, when there's a body big enough about the decisions, I imagine that they'll do something like the European Court of Human Rights did, which is to issue guidelines based on certain cases that have been brought forward. And again, this is an invitation for anyone who is listening and attending to engage in this process and write about it and make suggestions to the oversight board. this is the moment. It's a historical moment, really, that this organization has been created and has opened its doors and windows for input, not only in the form of appeals to Facebook or Facebook posting, but also in the form of creating a dialogue about the governance issues, and also creating a dialogue on how issues can be handled in ways that benefit both freedom of expression and the preservation of all the other human rights.
Yeah.
Well,
Stephen, and I realize I answered your question more about Facebook than about the oversight board, but I would, and Christina did a good job of explaining about the oversight board, but I would also add that many of the oversight board members were selected because they are known and outspoken people with who already have an audience, and that's why they're with us. And all of them will continue to have an audience, and I think their audience will be their human rights advocates and others, and I think they're all, and journalists, many journalists with that. I think their audience will be, or their outspokenness will be enhanced by this experience. They'll have more to talk about and probably a wider platform.
Terrific. Well, both of you have given us a lot to chew on, and I can tell from the chat lines that people are stimulated and ready to get into the conversation. So I'm going to turn moderation over to my colleague, Louise Hallman, who is in the beautiful Max Reinhardt Library in Salzburg. And wish I could be there too. But in any case, Louise, as our Director of Communications, is going to moderate the question part of this discussion, and I'll come back at the end for a little wind up. But Louise, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And indeed, yes, I am here currently in Salzburg, in the historic Max Reinhardt Library. We're delighted that this week we've been finally able to bring people back to Salzburg after many months of closed Schloss. And we really look forward to, at some point, being able to welcome all of our fellows back here too. But without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to our fellows to ask questions. First up is Tali Nates, who is a fellow of our Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Program, as well as the Asia Peace Innovators Forum. And she is the Executive Director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center in South Africa. Tali, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to join you from Johannesburg. And Christina, I do agree with you, historical moment indeed. And I sort of reflect back on the struggle with the issue of Holocaust denial to get to that point where it is recognized as dangerous speech, you know, and that took a long time. We were part of that process. So I want you guys to maybe reflect about time and process, specifically when there are urgent matters. And I'm thinking about rise of dangerous speech and hate speech on Facebook, if it is anti-Semitism, for example, currently. But I'm actually thinking about my region. In Zambia, there will be general elections in August, and genocidal speech is appearing. You know, words like snakes and cockroaches and, you know, get rid of them. That is very familiar from Rwanda. How do we get the process to be faster because of the danger to people on the ground, because hate speech becomes violence on the ground?
Paul, you want to take that? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Okay. I think if I had to give a one-word answer, I'd say algorithms. Because there's a lot of algorithms that immediately take things down, and maybe I should have explained this, that will find a keyword like Holocaust and some of the abusive language, some of the terrorism that you heard, and immediately take things down. They don't buck them to an individual, they just simply take them down. The algorithm will cite things that are questionable and buck those over to a reviewer. And as I said, a complaint from another user will take it automatically to a reviewer. But we have a whole lot of things come down automatically. And I think one of the things that needs to be done here in your regard is to make sure that the automatic removals that happen instantly as soon as the word is typed are as robust as they need to be, particularly in a situation like that. I'll give you there's an algorithm for child exploitation and child, nudity or pornography that is automatic, that takes down anything based on a few keywords, no bucking it to anybody, down immediately. Last year, in the first quarter of 2019, it took down 12 million of those automatically. In the first quarter of 2021, it took down only 5 million of those. And I think I would attribute the robustness of that to the fact that people aren't trying to put that up anymore. So that's maybe too facile, but I think that's an important part of it. And suggestions about that, and suggestions that you put in, your group puts in, and I don't know whether you're one of the groups that has been reached out to by the oversight board, but there are groups that we communicated with, and I hope you'll be one of them, that have helped to coach us on those things, what to anticipate, what to think, and so we can make the algorithms more robust, because that's where it gets taken down immediately and the harm doesn't get spread. Christina, do you have?
Well, quick, Facebook has paid a lot of attention to this, and they have admitted that they don't always get it right. Artificial intelligence doesn't get nuance or context right. There was an experiment recently where artificial intelligence was asked to develop pickup lines at bars, and it struggled. It couldn't do that. So it's important to have that human component. And what's also important is that the oversight board is crafting mechanisms to come up with much faster decisions, and that has its own limitations and virtues. But most importantly, after the oversight board issued its first decision, they sent it to Facebook. Facebook was like, these are some of the things that we can't do. So an implementation team comprised of Facebook and oversight board members has been created so that the technical people, the engineers, can coach the oversight board members how it works, and the oversight board members can help the engineers come up with formulas to identify context. I have to give a shout out to Cato Reagan, who sits on our board of trustees, who just wanted to share. She sat on the Constitutional Court in South Africa. So she's a fabulous trustee and colleague, and she's well aware of the challenges in the region. So if the oversight board is missing the point on something, yes, I so strongly encourage you to reach out to us and make sure your voices are being heard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tali, for that brilliant opening question and sort of moving us into some of the thornier issues of the Facebook Oversight Board. Next up from our questioners, we have Mariana Olizola Rosenblatt, who is a Cutler Fellow and also a lecturer in law at the University of Chicago. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Luis. So yes, I'm Mariana. I am a faculty fellow at the University of Chicago and also an alumna of the Salzburg Cutler Fellowships program. So my question is a normative one, future looking, and I'm really interested in your independent and visionary perspectives on this question. What do you think should be the binding power of international human rights law on a private company like Facebook, given its immense implications of its activities on human rights enjoyment around the world? Do you think Facebook, and as an offshoot of Facebook, the board itself, should see itself as a subject of international human rights law with an obligation to abide by it, particularly as Stephen was saying earlier, in contexts where the local law is actually in conflict with human rights? Thank you.
So that's the question, right? How do we create a normative framework that can be applied? The board members have emphasized, and you'll see it in the charter and in all of the governing documents for the oversight board, that human rights principles, particularly freedom of expression principles. This is Cristina Arriaga's opinion, not the oversight board, not the trustees, what I'm about to say. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it was drafted in 1948, had very strong, robust standards. And the standards of freedom of expression, Article 19, have been watered down by every subsequent instrument after that. So what you have is you have bad actors using human rights law in order to prevent individuals from having true freedom of expression, either under the guise of security. You see that in China, you see that in many other parts of the world, or offense. So imagine not being able to say anything that was offensive. Well, that then becomes a big issue for freedom of religion. That becomes a big issue for individuals who have deeply held convictions that are perhaps not the norm for the rest of society. And you've seen these laws emerge to the detriment of freedom of expression in many of the international courts. So do I believe that the oversight board or Facebook or a private company should be subject to these rules and regulations? I would argue absolutely not. The robust freedom of expression protections that inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have been watered down consistently. And this is another place where the Oversight Board can have a dialogue that hasn't been had since 1948 about what is freedom of expression. How do we balance out these rights? And I think that would be an important question. I don't know, maybe Paul disagrees with me.
I completely agree with what you said, but I think that if you look at the Facebook community standards, and if you look at the opinions of the oversight board, there are references to international human rights standards. But I think, particularly based on what Christina said, I think we should reference them and honor them, but not be directly subject to them for all the reasons that she cited. But we certainly should follow and do follow. We, the oversight board, certainly should follow and do follow the essence and the intention of the human rights standards.
Thank you, Mariana, for that question also. Next up, we have another fellow who is from a very different background, from our Culture and Arts and Society program. Damaso Reyes is the owner of Clarify Media and also a photojournalist. Damaso, please pose your question.
Thank you so much. My question focuses around social media. And increasingly, we are thinking of our social media spaces as a kind of digital commons, a place where we can gather and communicate to each other, much like physical commons. Should we start thinking about them in that way in terms of regulation? Should the community be more actively involved in creating the rules and norms around speech in these spaces, rather than social media company employees who are ultimately not accountable to users?
Yeah, we've mentioned a couple of times, I absolutely agree that it's important for the users to look, the reasoning behind this for Mark Zuckerberg when he started the community standards was, we want this to be a place that's comfortable for people to communicate, and it's effective for people to communicate, and is a good experience. And whenever we're asked about the benefits of social media, we often refer to the Arab Spring as an important thing that couldn't have happened without social media. So absolutely, the users have to control it, but not every user, because there are bad people out in the world, and they will, as we've observed too many times to mention, if all the users are involved, or if every user is honored fully and therefore allowed to participate fully without any controls, then we don't have any. But I think what you suggested is, what you're suggesting, Tommaso, is that some significant form of outreach to users about the development of the community standards and the oversight board's enforcement and decisions under those standards is important. I'd say absolutely yes. Your input is most welcome, and the more of that we can get, the better. Christina?
I think you said it all, Paul. But Tommaso, I had a follow-up question for you. What do you think should be the case? What do you think should happen?
Well, I think that Louise and the folks at Salzburg should invite us all to the Schloss to have a very long conversation about this. And I say that tongue in cheek, but actually have been pushing for this a little bit, because I do think this is a very, very knotty, complicated issue, right? Because on one hand, if we begin to think of social media spaces as digital commons, and we should regulate speech in that way, and we should, if you're an American, then you might say, hey, let's have freedom of speech. Let's make fewer restrictions on speech. Obviously, countries around the world have different restrictions. There are things I could say on a street corner in the United States, in New York City, where I happen to be, that I could not say in Barcelona, where I live most of the time. That would be put in jail for. So how do you navigate that? If I had the answer, I'd probably be very wealthy. But I do think that we need to talk about this, and we need to get smart people in the room to see if we can actually come to some kind of consensus, or at least a framework to create a consensus. Because I think the one thing we can all agree on is the system as it exists is fairly opaque, definitely undemocratic, and nobody likes it. So there is probably a better solution, even if it's not a perfect solution, but it's going to be one that I think ends up being generated by the community, not just by a bunch of engineers in Menlo Park or in Washington or in Berlin. And we need to begin to bring a larger group of people together to have a conversation on these issues, so we can begin to work it out collectively.
I think that's going to be I think that's going to be the challenge of your generation. I often talk about the fact that I grew up in Puerto Rico. I love Puerto Rico, but in certain parts of the island, a traffic light is a strong suggestion and nothing more, or the colors of the flag of Italy. It's going to take a big shift in culture for people to understand that even if there isn't a cop looking at what you do, it is important for society for you to stop that, to have a rule of law, what lawyers would call it, right? But a culture of freedom of expression that respects all of users' safety. And to Facebook's credit, safety plays a big role in the decisions that they make regarding to the community standards. I mean, that's why they banned Mr. Trump from being on the platform, because they felt he was putting other people's lives at risk. And by the way, I'm super paraphrasing the 33-page decision, so I encourage you to read it rather than count on my interpretation of it. But yes, you're right, Tommaso, Louise, we need to have a conversation about this.
Tommaso, in your framing, you talked about the community space and marketplace of ideas. It reminds me of the piece I read a while back from the it was the Manchester Tribune, and it was a woman describing, she referred to it as the Gutenberg parenthesis. She said before Gutenberg, everything we got was from the marketplace, and you had to figure out for yourself whom to believe, what to trust, and you had to go find all the other opinions. Then Gutenberg came along, and you had a bunch of curated, edited media that came in that you knew, you at least knew that the information you got, you may or may not believe it, you may or not appreciate it, but at least it'd been curated, because there were editors of the books, there were publishers of the papers. Now, as soon as the internet came around, we're back to the marketplace, the pre-Gutenberg, and you're now getting a lot of, for the first time in 500 years, you're really getting a vast amount of information that's not been curated. And so we're all struggling. What do you replace the curation you used to get from a network, a television show, radio, an NPR, a Simon and Schuster, whatever, or a Washington Post? What do you get to replace it? Because it's just a bunch of unregulated voices, and that's the question of the century.
This is my very
that
brief plug for media literacy. Sorry, Louise, and I'm a media literacy practitioner, but we need to begin to have this conversation because, super briefly, obviously technology in the way we get information has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Our culture around information and interpreting it and understanding it and filtering has not. And so that needs to be part of, I think, this conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly, how do we go about regulating this is part of our discussion today. Facebook does have an alternate model. Is it applicable to other platforms? I would like to bring in somebody to pose that question, which is Andrea Boston, who has participated in some of our finance forums as well as attending our board meetings and Cutler lectures. Andrea, would you like to pose your question to our panelists?
Hello, I'm calling you from Jacksonville, Florida. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for having this discussion.
Great to see you, Andy.
It's nice seeing you too. Hopefully I'll see you in person at some point, really soon. So my question, it revolves around the fact that this is obviously a very difficult experiment that Facebook has taken on. And if you think about other situations almost where, standards are being sort of set by you coming into the market first, or Zuckerberg, Facebook coming into the market first with this idea, there's obviously a whole bunch of iteration that has to happen in terms of learning how to execute this well. So let's say, assuming that Facebook becomes something of a standard for other current and future media platforms, how do you scale the model that Facebook has introduced? And is that even possible? There's a large human component, which is something that, I don't understand how you take that from the size that you are today to the millions and perhaps, approaching billions of issues that you might, confront. So that would be my question, is how do you scale what you're doing and become a standard potentially for other social media platforms that either exist today or in the future?
You want to start, Christina?
My answer is, I don't know. I don't know how to scale it, and that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
But the beauty of it is as Einstein said, right? Imagination is more important than knowledge, and beginning to look precisely what the Salzburg Global Seminar does, beginning to look at the future with a set of challenges that almost seem unsurmountable, but having the faith that a solution exists. And this is something that is a real technical question, but it's also a question of recognizing what we know and what we don't know. And if you remember Kahneman's book, he won the Nobel Prize for Thinking Fast and Slow, the idea that we could separate ourselves from it and take a new look at things, which has already been applied to economics, and it has already been applied to certain of the financial fields, will be the important. But after I said I don't know, maybe Paul has the answer, and he just hasn't told me how to do this.
If I had the answer, I'd definitely tell you. But Andy, just a couple thoughts on that. Well, if I had to do one word, I'd say algorithms. In the answer to scaling, it's the only way we can deal with it now, let alone scaling. And the algorithms, as we've talked about, have limits to them. They can do a lot, but they also leave out some of the subtlety and context is necessary. But interestingly, you talk about the other social media joining, and as your good husband Byron knows, who was also involved in FINRA with me, that self-regulatory model, everyone's a member, and in order to just be in the business, you have to be a member, and it works very well because of it. And when I first joined this, I thought, oh, but this will be self-regulation, and one of our goals will be to get all the other media platforms to sign on. As we've gone forward, I've become less and less sort of convinced that that can happen, but mostly I've been less and less driven to do things structurally for the sole purpose of attracting other social media. This is singular, and I think we really need to get it right for Facebook, and that's going to take a few years or forever. But get it right for Facebook, and then if other people want to join, that's fine. But if others see different needs, that's and want to be differently regulated or differently governed, that's fine too. I think, though, what's going to happen over time, Andy, is that that users will appreciate the idea that they can participate on a platform that is moderated, regulated, and has an outside body involved, and that will cause people to come to Facebook and maybe avoid others like Parler, and that will enhance it. And then the other organizations will see the benefit of this kind of regulation, self-regulation, and they will either adopt their own or join in with ours. And either of those would be fine. We, maybe hope they join ours, but I think a bunch of different models could work. But I bet this becomes attractive enough that competition causes our model to proliferate and scale, as the term you used.
I'd like to thank all of our fellows who posed questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to everybody who posted questions in the chat box, as is the nature of the shortness of our time together. But I want to pass back over to Stephen to pose our final question to our panelists. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Christina and Paul, for your excellent interaction with our question. And thanks to our questioners for being so thoughtful in the way you have so succinctly identified and put forward some tough areas that are going to require lots more discussion, experimentation, standard setting, so on. We're at the beginning of this process, both in terms of this experiment, the Facebook Oversight Court, but also more broadly, and how do we manage this very different set of circumstances in our communications environment. I'll ask a couple of questions, and I'll make a couple of observations at the end. This will sound as self-serving as it is, but I love the fact that it was suggested that Salzburg could be an ideal place to bring together some continuing conversation on this subject. And of course, we have done quite a bit of conversing around issues related to today's topic over our history, but there's so much more that needs to be tackled. And I guess my question to both of you is, if you were putting together such a off-the-record conversation, who would you want to have in the room besides your fellow trustees and participants? And is this ever something that Facebook itself might be prepared to help make happen? Because, as much as we've covered a lot of territory today, I think many of the questions that were asked and the ones that we haven't had time to get to really do go to this cross-border, cross-culture, cross-legal set of complications, which you guys are having to swim in every day, and which we are set up to tackle. That is why we exist. And so I'd love to figure out some way that we could independently carry this forward. And I'd just be interested in both of you, who, if you, it's a little bit like that question sometimes newspapers ask, if you could have a dinner party and invite 3 people, who would you invite? And I guess, you know, having talked to a lot of people and so forth in this field, whether they're on the board or not on the board, if you could invite 3 or 4 people to the conversation in Salzburg, who would you invite? And do you think this could really be valuable in going in directions that may not arise quite so directly out of cases and complaints that Facebook has to deal with?
Well, Stephen, since you brought up the dinner party plate, I have to a question. I'll have to ask a clarifying question. Do they all have to be living?
They always finesse that.
Okay, right. Okay,
Newspaper.
let's assume it's again invite Lincoln and the Lincoln Douglas debates or something, or James Madison. But assuming it's living people, well, I'd start with Damaso and Tali and Andy and the other people who asked questions of us today, and most of the people on this who took the time to listen to us, and everyone who submitted questions. But I just, you know, I think we can all think of a lot of regular people, and I'd love to bring some of our board members, particularly our non-US board members, and Kate, who Christina mentioned. But Christina's going to laugh because this is a term I keep using in our meetings when we talk about adding members to the board itself, as well as to our own board of trustees, is I'd like to get some upholsterers in there, by which I mean people who aren't necessarily advocates or you know, international lawyers or professors who can bring some common sense viewpoint. What did, you know, most of our users are not intellectuals, they're regular people. And so one of the demographics I'd like to get in there, in addition to all the, you know, people who think very deeply about all these issues, is just some regular people who want to have a decent experience on social media. So upholsterers.
Thank you, Paul.
Christina?
You want to add to that?
100 names came to mind, but rather than mentioning names, I think it'd be terrific for Salzburg to think of this as an interdisciplinary question, as it has in the past, and as the oversight board was set up. I agree with Damaso, for instance, that media literacy, being able to have debates, is an important issue. But the one thing I wanted to add is that it's important, it's vital, in fact, to address the issues associated with cancel culture, which I think are the gravest threat for freedom of expression. It's not social media platforms, it's not bad laws. All of those can affect freedom of expression. But the fact that we now can tag someone who said something offensive and then cancel them from our lives becomes a very big issue for freedom of expression online and in real life. So talking about how to address that issue would be vital to freedom of expression in social media platforms.
Thank you. That certainly resonates with me and many of my friends who live in fear for speaking truth to power and so on. Just wanted to make a couple of short observations. I think the conversation speaks for itself, and it's been, it invites more in-depth pursuit of these issues. And I do hope Salzburg can play a role in that without feeling we have any corner on truth, but we are a great place to bring people who don't agree on everything together, including ordinary people and experts and people from different sectors and geographies. And so I'd love to see us be able to mount that kind of a forward thrust. I mentioned in my opening the Salzburg Academy on Media and Global Change. I did to the suggestion from our one of our questioners about media literacy. I will say that this group of universities and participants from 5 continents has done an amazing job of developing ideas in media literacy and promoting them around the world. And I wish we could have kept our Chinese friends from Tsinghua in as partners. They were one of the original partners, but that didn't prove to be possible. Then we went to Hong Kong, and I hope we're going to be able to keep our Hong Kong partner in. But we're a place where we're trying to have the kinds of conversations that matter on these subjects. And you know, as much as we can regulate, whether privately or publicly, people are their own regulators also, and they have to be informed about things to watch out for and ways that they can contribute to dialogue and create their own media as well. So we've tried to develop some ideas in Salzburg each summer with this coalition, and it's a very lively summer event. The couple of quick observations. One is, I think this question of public-private self-regulation, where does one start and stop? I know, Paul, you started out many years ago as a young lawyer at the SEC, and I suspect you would argue that the fact that there was an SEC and there was a sort of body of clear principles and threats and penalties for inappropriate activity made it possible for creative self-regulation to flourish. And I think, you know, sometimes we have a tendency to go all in one way or all in the other. And I think we are going to see the need for a revolution in public regulation thinking, as well as a revolution in private self-regulation. This is my personal opinion. And one will reinforce the other if done correctly. So I think it's just important to be looking at both aspects of that. I'm also intrigued by the notion that several brought up about the digital commons. I really do think we are struggling with how to create a digital commons and standards for digital commons that people have confidence in and believe is going to encourage full expression and not be used in ways against them or just to give extremists opportunities to speak. I want to stop there and thank everybody who has participated today. You've just been terrific. Paul, Christina, thank you so much for your contributions. Our questioners have been terrific. The team that has worked to put this together has just been marvelous. So I look forward to the next designs on the future. And will human ingenuity be enough? Not unrelated to our question today, but maybe a little more cosmic. These questions are trying to stretch the frame of our thinking about the future and to help us think about where Salzburg can make its greatest contribution. So thank you all for being part of the Salzburg community, and we look forward to seeing you, I hope, at a future Designs on the Future conversation. Thanks very much indeed.